Dear friends, welcome to yet another installment of Strategic Power. In this video, we analyze the political instability in Israel as Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet faces internal divisions over several crucial issues. These include the conscription of ultra-Orthodox Jews, divergences over strategy in the war in Gaza, and political maneuvers by rivals aimed at undermining Netanyahu's leadership. With the Prime Minister's popularity declining and the imminent possibility of early elections, Netanyahu is linking his political survival to the continuation of the conflict. However, the question remains whether he will be able to avoid such elections, which could result in his removal from office. Additionally, tensions with the United States over the Palestinian issue and settlements are only further complicating the situation. It remains uncertain whether the situation in the Gaza Strip will have the power to overthrow Netanyahu. For a comprehensive understanding of these events, it is essential to watch the video until the end. Before continuing, in case you haven't already, we recommend that you subscribe and turn on notifications to stay informed about our upcoming videos. The coalition cabinet led by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is far from cohesive, being described by some as mired in internal conflicts. Since October 7th, Netanyahu's popularity has declined, and polls indicate that he and his party may lose power in the next elections. However, he has managed to remain in office so far, while the conflict in Gaza persists. Nevertheless, various factors are combining to pose a threat to his leadership, including political disputes over the conscription of ultra-Orthodox Jews, maneuvers by major political rivals within the cabinet, divergences over the conduct of the war, and an increasingly strained relationship with the United States. First, it is important to understand a bit about the Haredi community in Israel. The Haredim are ultra-Orthodox Jews, representing about 13% of the country's population, who have maintained a complex relationship with the secular and less religious majority of Israel over the decades. A central issue has been the exemption from compulsory military service for young Haredim, allowing them to dedicate themselves fully to religious studies in yeshivas, with subsidies provided by the government. In 2017, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that the blanket exemption for yeshiva students was unconstitutional, and ordered the government to draft legislation to address this issue within a year. However, due to political instability, with 5 elections in less than 4 years, there were several extensions of that deadline. Now, we come to the present day, and Netanyahu's government faces a deadline until late March to present new legislation regulating Haredi military service. The Attorney General of Israel informed the Higher Court that if no legislation is presented by April 1st, the state will be obliged to draft Haredi men for military service and suspend state subsidies to yeshiva students. As you must know, the October 7th Hamas attacks and the ensuing war hindered progress toward a solution to this issue. Tensions have increased between the Haredim who do not serve and their fellow citizens being drafted into military service in record numbers. The government is moving to extend the period of service and increase the age at which they are released from duty. The challenge for Netanyahu is that his coalition includes several small Haredi parties that oppose the revocation of the exemption and the conscription of Haredi Israelis. Any solution that leaves them dissatisfied could cause the government to collapse. With the deadline approaching rapidly, Netanyahu faces an even more complicated situation with his own defense minister, Yoav Gallant of the Likud party, entering into conflict over his controversial judicial reforms. Gallant called for an end to the blanket exemption for the Haredim, arguing that, without physical existence, there is no spiritual existence, and defending that everyone must bear the burden of military service. He made it clear that he will only present the legislation if he has the support of all parties in the emergency coalition, including not only the ultra-Orthodox parties, but also Benny Gantz's National Unity Party. Despite serving in the war cabinet, Gantz is Netanyahu's main political rival. While Netanyahu's popularity has fallen since October 7th, Gantz's party is leading in opinion polls. This suggests that the anti-Netanyahu bloc could easily topple his government if there were an early election. There are a few possible outcomes here. If the proposed legislation is acceptable to Benny Gantz, this could displease the ultra-Orthodox parties and potentially collapse the government. On the other hand, if it is too favourable to the ultra-Orthodox parties, Gantz may refuse to back it. If Gallant does not present the legislation, the deadline will pass, the exemption will end, and the state will have to begin drafting Haredi students and end funding for yeshivas. This would also lead the ultra-Orthodox parties to abandon the government, causing its collapse. Given the polls mentioned earlier, Netanyahu has reason to fear an election, while Gantz, who holds a veto power over the legislation, has plenty of reasons to want one, especially one in which the issue of ending the Haredi exemption is at the forefront, as most Israelis support this measure. For Netanyahu, it seems he is relying on the war to survive politically, as he knows he will likely be defeated in elections when the situation calms down and the Israeli public gets a chance to vote. He has made it clear that a general election during the war would be a defeat for Israel, calling it the exact dream of Ismail Haniyeh and Iran, referring to the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. But Netanyahu will not be able to avoid elections forever, and there are other visible divisions in his government as well. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has caused a separate series of problems. For example, he proposed banning Palestinians and restricting Israeli Arabs from frequenting the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem during Ramadan. This proposal led prominent cabinet members to bypass Ben-Gvir and assume responsibility for policy decisions related to the Flashpoint site. Additionally, Ben-Gvir publicly called for the government to end ceasefire and hostage negotiations with Hamas, arguing that we must intensify the war, that is the only way to defeat it, going completely against what the United States, Israel's main ally, has called for, which will only increase the Biden administration's frustration with the Israeli government. Moreover, the United States strongly rebuked Ben-Gvir and far-right Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich for advocating the re-establishment of Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. At the other end of the cabinet spectrum is Benny Gantz. He recently made a high-level visit to the United States, where he met with Vice President Kamala Harris, among others. Netanyahu did not authorize Gantz's trip, which apparently left him furious, and he severely reprimanded Gantz, reminding him that Israel has only one prime minister. This is Netanyahu's current situation. He is being pulled in opposite directions by different factions of the cabinet, and there are decisions that must be made imminently that could risk the collapse of his government. The two main ministers, Gallant and Gantz, seem to be acting independently of Netanyahu in ways that, intentionally or not, appear to undermine him. While all this is happening, Netanyahu sees his main rival, Benny Gantz, on an unauthorized trip to the United States, meeting with Kamala Harris and Antony Blinken. This suggests that Gantz is far more acceptable to the White House, and as one analyst says, it sends an unequivocal signal of dissatisfaction with Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu finds himself in a difficult situation, with his own war cabinet divided and working against him. His political survival is directly linked to the war in Gaza, but how long will he be able to delay the elections that will most likely remove him from power? The United States is impatient and irritated with the provocations of Netanyahu's far-right ministers toward the Palestinians. Meanwhile, his political rivals are preparing to take power as soon as the dust settles. This may be Netanyahu's last desperate attempt to cling to office. But do Israelis really want a prime minister, so desperate to remain in power that he is willing to risk the stability and security of the country? Leave your comment on what you think will happen, and whether Netanyahu will finally be removed after this explosive crisis. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up with all developments in this tense situation in our upcoming videos.